how different is this version of GST post this meeting than what was originally envisioned, considering that a majority, nearly 80% of items have been moved out of the 28% slab? One may ask, why were they there in the first place?
I don't think there'll be any change in this architecture of GST post today's meeting. It's the same GST. Why the rates have been changed today is because some revenue numbers have come, and the revenue numbers are looking much better than we expected them to be. For instance, states' losses are down from 28% to 17%, which in actual numbers means down from 12,000 to 7,500. Now, when this was started, one wasn't sure of how the numbers would look at. So today, the GST Council, looking at the numbers, got emboldened to cut these rates. So I don't see any reason why it should be posed as if this GST is very different from what it was earlier. And I can show you minutes of GST Council meetings, and I have spoken publicly, that over time, there will be a convergence of rates. It will eventually go to a rate because 0, 28 and 5. 5 is a merit good rate, 28 is a demerit good rate. 12 and 18 will collapse to somewhere around 14% over time. But one needs the system to stabilize, and one needs to look at how the revenues are behaving. So from the first indication that we got today was revenues are better than, in fact, the cess collection, which is to fund compensation of states, is more than the revenue loss of states today. I'm talking of August.
Okay. Mr. Drabu, you mentioned earlier in the day, and several finance ministers actually said that as a result of moving these items, 178 items from 28 to 18% and some lower down, there would be revenue losses of about 20,000 crore rupees. Now, during that press conference which followed the announcement, Finance Minister Arun Jaitley said that this was an academic discussion because he expected compliance to increase. Is there anything to back the assumption that compliance would increase to fill in that gap? And, how much of a burden do we see? Is this 20,000 crore rupees something that we're looking at increasing?
Look, it's a notional loss as on today's basis. Now, when you've gotten numbers, revenue distribution as it were, then what you're seeing is something very interesting. 10% of SSEs account for 90% of revenues. So if you were to let go of the entire 90% and focus on the 10%, you would forget 90% of the revenues. Now, if compliance improves in the 90%, even by 1%, you have more than covered the notional losses that we expect as a thing of rate cut. So let us be clear on some of these things. What is not in public domain today is the distribution of revenues, how it is happening. So to that extent that we have these numbers and we are seeing a certain pattern emerge, you will see that these 20,000 crore losses, which are notional as of now based on rate cuts that we've done today, will get compensated not only through better compliance, but also through better buoyancy.
Mr. Drabu, I have a question on moving restaurants and all categories of restaurants from 18 to 5%. The reasoning behind that which was provided was that restaurants were not passing on the gains they had from input tax credit to their customers. Just taking that forward, why then have they been rewarded with a lower tax rate instead of, enforcing that passing on of input tax credit benefits to customers?
I don't think it's about rewarding or penalizing. Tax rates can't be used for that. The thing is that ideally what could have happened, what the industry wanted was a 12% with ITC. And if you look at the ITC claims, they are roughly about 78%. So the incidence of tax is the same because 5% is without ITC. Now, ITC for restaurants is a very limited category. It's not about food items which are mostly served in restaurants are tax exempted. So there won't be much ITC there. The ITC that's coming for restaurants is on rent, the rented premises. That affects only a certain class and certain type of restaurants. So I think what we have done today is to make it much simpler for everybody. I'm sure the industry will have its views on it. Those who are organized in a different way will have lots to say about it. But in terms of simplicity, 5% for a standalone right across will improve compliance in a major way. But you're right, that the sore point of the GST Council with the restaurants was that when the rates were cut, these were not passed on to the customer. And a lot of the negativity on GST in the larger public at large came from the restaurants when, the earlier rates were tagged on another 18% tax. So I think that's where what was going in the mind of the council when this was decided.
Okay, Mr. Drabu, there were two agendas that Mr. Jaitley pointed out that, the council has not been able to have consensus over. One is the inclusion of real estate, and second is whether interstate supplies should be, made available to composition dealers, etc. What is the thinking on that, and in which direction can we expect these two items to head towards?
Yeah, I think real estate wasn't even discussed. I think a conceptual note which we didn't find time to discuss. At the moment, we are kind of trying to sort out the existing rate. So real estate is a little still far off from where we stand today. What's the other one? Because if in composition you allow interstate and ITC, then there are two issues. One, it tampers with the architecture of GST. But more critically, it hurts small states. Something like Manipur, 84% of revenues come from interstate. J&K, 60%. Now you can't jeopardize the revenue base of small states only to, benefit a certain class of traders. Now composition has been made more attractive. The rates have been dropped to 1%. The cutoff has been taken to 1.5, eventually going to 2. So B2C, I don't think more can be done. But there is scope to look at the B2B, because I think that's where there's a problem with the SME sector, which is facing a breakdown of supply chain because you cannot buy from the composition dealers because they don't get ITC credit. Some solutions have been found eventually on how to handle that.
Just one last question, Mr. Drabu. You mentioned earlier in this conversation that we're moving towards a collapsing of the mid rates, the 18 and 12 to perhaps 14%. Could you expand on that thought and your views on that thought? How soon should that happen? What should be that mid rate? And do you see the council moving towards that process?
Look, if you look at it today, you have 5, 12, 18, 28 and 0. 0 is exempted category. 5 is the merit good rate. 28 is demerit, so you're left with 12 and 18. Eventually, they'll collapse at around 14% depending on the buoyancy and the revenue corrections. I don't see it happening in the next 6 months, but I think a year from now, we should be able to do that. Have a three-rate structure with a merit rate, a demerit rate, and a base rate. And that's the intention of the council from day one.
All right. Thank you so much for speaking with us. Haseeb Drabu, the Finance Minister of Jammu and Kashmir.